Welcome to Talking Late Night, where we spotlight top comedians and their late night influences. Here's your host, Max Cantor.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Talking Late Night. I'm your host, Max Cantor, and today on the show, I have a LA-based stand-up comedian. She's the winner of Portland's Funniest Comedian. She's been featured at multiple festivals and shows, including the San Francisco Sketch Fest and Doug Loves Movies. She co-hosts the Who's Your God podcast and also appeared and was a semi-finalist on Season 9 of NBC's Last Comic Standing. So please welcome to the show, Amy Miller. Welcome to the show, Amy.
Hey, how's it going?
Now,
nice
Amy,
to talk to you.
Amy, this is totally true. We originally sat down, or we didn't sit down, but we had scheduled to do an interview way back in April, and because of conflicting things, it just never worked out to here. I've had that intro on my computer since April because I believed. I knew it would happen, and so I just never deleted it. And so my introductions for all my different guests are all on the same page on my computer. But once I interview the guest, once I do their write-up and publish the show, I typically delete it. But I've had yours, Amy. I've had yours for months
I'm glad
now.
it finally worked out. I'm always on the run, so
Yeah,
thanks for your patience.
that's totally fine. I'm glad to have you here. I'm excited to talk to you. You've done a lot of stuff. And so that's what I'm excited to talk to you about and how you've done it all. So to get started, I just want to ask you, growing up, what type of late night talk shows or just television in general influenced you in your comedy?
A lot of different television for sure, but I was always a late night kid. I've never been a great sleeper, so
Yeah.
I'm really dating myself here, but obviously Carson was my earliest. That also tells you kind of how young I was staying up that late. But Arsenio was huge for me. And then, Letterman's my favorite of all time for sure. I went to the second to last taping of his show a few years back. And
Wow.
he's always been very, very special to me.
So that's very interesting. You mentioned going to a late night taping because you're my first guest who I talk about late night with every comedian I have on. That's why the show's called Talking Late Night. You're the first one that's ever, sat in the studio audience. I've had guests who worked backstage in the shows but never just observed it. So describe to me, what was that feeling like with Letterman's second to last show, the end of an era concluding? What was the feel in the audience, and also what do you think the feel was in him?
It was my second time going. I had gone to a different Letterman taping probably 6 years earlier when I was in New York. The feeling was definitely very different because it was, as I said, the second to last show. And so it's just crazy guests. And, I saw Bob Dylan, Bill Murray, but it was also the goodbye to Rupert and Hello Deli. So that was very touching, very sad. I don't know what his feeling was. He seemed pretty normal. He seems like someone who always kind of played everything pretty close to the chest. So, we saw him get a little bit emotional in those final episodes for sure. The night I was there, it was nothing too crazy, but the audience was definitely a lot of real kind of long-standing fans because there were several hoops you kind of had to jump through to get these tickets. It was really special to me. It was a very big goal for me to get on that stage at some point, and that's kind of something I'm working on. So next. I'd rather be there than watching the taping for sure.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned that your three big late night people would be Carson, Arsenio, and Letterman. So looking at all three, what do you think, in your opinion, that all three of them had in common that attracted you to them?
I think there's kind of just a raw charisma, and I would almost say even like a swagger that they have that, in my mind, like someone like Jay Leno never had. I was never a fan of his show. I just really couldn't stand the way he talked to people, and I feel like I don't know, there's just sort of a confidence and a kindness. I know it's a weird thing in my life now, but I sort of know Arsenio. I've worked with him a few times, and that's pretty nuts to me, given how much time I spent watching him
Yeah.
late night as a kid.
Hmm.
But he, as a person, is just very sweet and open. And I mean, it's almost like a really specific superpower. I think there's like a handful of famous people that seem to have it, and a lot of them end up having their own talk shows because they're, specifically kind of in tune with people. I think like RuPaul is a good example of someone
Hmm.
like that. I mean, there's a million names, but I think that's something that they all kind of shared was just like being a star without taking the attention from the guest, um, in kind of like it's like a confident humility almost,
Hmm.
that I think that they mastered more, and I think Conan for sure has it too. Um, but I think Letterman was kind of the peak of that for me, of pulling off this sort of like awkward, kind of bumbling nerd character, even though you kind of knew it wasn't true because he's seems to be one of the more confident people. But it's been interesting watching his Netflix series for sure because he's so out of context and out of his comfort zone, and you kind of get a glimpse into what he's really like, outside of the late night show. But yeah, I think it's just kind of a openness and confidence.
Hmm. Yeah, totally. I mean, all three people you just described, they do just radiate the self confidence, and I think you bringing up RuPaul was a excellent example because it's all people who just are confident in who they are, and then when they're confident in themselves, I feel like we trust them more. You get what I'm saying? Because if
Yeah,
they trust themselves, so we can trust them more easy.
yeah, and there's a vulnerability there
Yeah.
too. And I think something that was really interesting with Arsenio, and to some extent, I think Letterman did this with musical acts and kind of like new bands that were about to break. But something interesting in the late '80s and early '90s with Arsenio is that he put a lot of people on his talk show that hadn't really done other shows yet. Like, he put a lot of rappers on, and like mainstream America wasn't yet that exposed to them. He had like Easy E on his show, and he had all the professional wrestlers on the show. I think he sort of had his finger on a pulse that the other late night talk shows were sort of missing because they were really busy catering to like a specific demographic of mostly like older professional white people probably.
Right.
And he kind of tapped into this thing that worked really well, and I think kind of got the ball rolling for a lot of the other late night shows to pay attention to. Like, oh yeah, we should be following this rap thing. It might be a big deal.
Right, and I mean Letterman did the same thing because in a slightly different way, where his stuff was just weird. He was just doing weird, outrageous things, and I mean nowadays, like he was so influential. Anytime you see a sketch on Conan or on Kimmel or Fallon, you can in some way track it back to something David Letterman did at some point in his career. So it's the new and just being self-confident and saying, you know what, we're going to do what we want to do and what the people want to see, not what the network is demanding us to do.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's not a coincidence that so many or most of those hosts start as comedians. I think there's kind of like a silliness factor and a commitment to the bit that you need to have to think a little bit outside of the box on late night. And I think that all those guys definitely had it.
Hmm. So you were watching these shows as a kid growing up. Did their confidence and their willingness to try new things, did that influence your comedy? Like as a kid, were you more self-confident than you feel like you would have been otherwise if you hadn't been watching late night?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I've always felt, I mean, I think it probably made me a little bit precocious, but I think staying up all night as a child would do that to anybody because you're kind of tuned into this whole other life that other kids at school aren't seeing. Probably watching a lot of stuff I should not have been seeing, but I've always been a kind of night person, a very anxious person, and someone who doesn't sleep well. So I did feel like I don't know about my comedic sensibilities. I'm sure that it affected them in some way. I didn't start comedy till I was 30, so I wasn't like a kid sitting around thinking that I was going to be a comedian one day. It had never crossed my mind ever. I had dreams of maybe having a talk show, but had no idea how that would ever happen because I had horrible stage fright and I was a really shy kid. But I think it definitely informed just my general sensibilities because I was sort of like aware of all this stuff that, other kids at my school weren't just because I was up all night and fucking watching Johnny Carson or whatever.
Right. So if you didn't get involved with comedy till you were 30, up until you turned 30, were you involved in any way with any type of performing or arts or anything in that community?
I was, so was a choral singer for many years, classical soprano, and I sang in professional kind of paid choirs for years and years through college and into, between 20 and 30. Actually, a little bit after I started comedy too, but then it just got too difficult to kind of juggle both. And it's something I still really miss a lot. There's something really specific about the experience of singing with other people and harmonizing with other people, especially if it's, really difficult music. The way that it exercises your brain is so specific just to read the music while coordinating with all these other humans. It's a very, I don't know, it's a particular sensation that I miss for sure. Having said that, it was almost always like in a choral setting where I was with other people. So I still kind of had my stage fright and wasn't too excited about, going out on my own and performing alone. And that's one of the reasons I dove into comedy was to kind of get over that fear. So the couple years that the two overlapped was interesting because then all of a sudden this choir director I had worked with for years, I'm like, oh, I want to do some solos. And he's just like, what? Like, you've never asked for this. Because I was kind of getting that confidence from performing alone and realized that, like, there's almost nothing scarier than doing comedy, so singing should be fine.
When you jumped into comedy, did you jump into stand-up immediately, or did you try improv and writing? What was your path in comedy?
I mean, I've always kind of been a writer, and I guess some of that was comedic. But yeah, my path was just going straight into a stand-up open mic at a laundromat in San Francisco, and yeah, just kind of jumped right in. Like, I definitely spent a few weeks, maybe a month, kind of thinking about jokes, obsessing over what I would even say if I got up there, and thinking about what kind of material I would want to do. But other than that, I just kind of got up. I mean, it's really the only way to do it. I mean, I guess a lot of people start with improv, but that wasn't something I really knew much about or, had much interest in. So I just went to an open mic.
Why do you think, I know you said you didn't have much interest in it, but why do you think you went from performing in a choir, so that's like all ensemble based, working as a team all together, like you were saying, everyone's working together to create the music, and instead of picking for your comedy world an improv pathway where it would be the same thing working with an ensemble, you chose to go by yourself? Was it to push yourself, or what was the reason?
It was, yeah. I mean, I was in the middle of a little bit of a life crisis, as I think a lot of people get to when they're turning 30. And it was just something that scared me so much I wanted to jump into it. And it was like the craziest thing that I could imagine doing. And then I didn't expect to keep doing it. I didn't even really expect to do it a second time, but I had some other friends who were going. They kind of thought it was a funny idea. And then those friends have since they didn't stay comedians. So they were kind of just my muse, or, the people that peer pressured me into going. And now I'm the one who's still doing it. But I never expected any of that to happen. But yeah, it was pretty much just a scary thing. And I was like, I'm so tired of having stage fright. I mean, that's something that can affect your life in so many different ways. I was just an extremely shy person. And so I didn't, even I had a professional job and I didn't ever want to give presentations. I didn't want to speak at our conferences. I felt scared about speaking up to like a waitress if I needed something else. You know what I mean? Like, I was just very, very shy and always second guess the things that I was going to say to people. And now, 8 years later, I probably should spend more time thinking about what I'm going to say out of my mouth.
So it really has, you would say, by being a stand-up comedian, do you feel like 100% of your stage fright has gone away, or do you still experience sometime episodes of where you get nervous when being in front of people?
Oh, I definitely get nervous if it's a new situation, new location, if it's a particularly huge crowd or a big opportunity or a TV thing. The nerves always come back, but I think what's changed is that now I kind of celebrate them. It's
Mm.
almost like being in a relationship with someone for a long time and then feeling those butterflies again. Like it's like, oh, this reminds me of when we first got together, so it's
Hmm.
kind of exciting because, um, and it is so much like that now I just kind of try to use the nerves to channel them to just make it a good set and feel excited again. It's also totally a drug. So
Yeah.
when you feel nervous, it's like, oh, here's that adrenaline rush that I used to always get from it, but now it's kind of few and far between. And it's interesting because now I kind of know a lot of, of course, comedy's very small, so I know a lot of comics that are much more senior to me that I think are geniuses and pros and never get nervous. And I constantly hear from people that they still do. So I kind of hope now that it's something that never goes away, but it certainly doesn't rule my life in the same way,
Mm,
which
mhm.
is nice.
Right, right. Are there mental strategies or techniques that you learned or currently use with stage fright?
Um, Interesting question. I mean, I think really just focusing on channeling it towards being a positive thing is probably my main technique. And then reminding myself that I am prepared.
Hmm.
And that really only comes with a lot of actual preparation, And I mean, one of the only ways to really achieve that is just to do comedy as much as I can all the time so that when I'm thrown into a new situation or something that would make me nervous, then I can sit down with myself and go, you do this every night. It's just another show. Like, you know how to do this.
Hmm.
I don't know how that experience goes for someone who doesn't perform very often. That would be very scary. Um, but that's why, anytime sort of senior comics give advice about how to get ahead, it's always just do as many sets as possible all the time. And that's always been kind of my philosophy. And so I really just try to turn it into a positive thing and then, yeah, remind myself that I'm prepared because I do this. And also that no one thing is the one thing. So opportunities come and go. You might get rejected for stuff. I get rejected for stuff all the time. But I feel comfortable knowing that when the next thing does come along, I will be ready for it because I've been preparing every night. You know what I mean?
Definitely. When you started, speaking of, performing every single night, when you first started, were you performing every single night, or how often at the very beginning of your stand-up career did you do a set?
As often as I could. I mean, there were a lot of mics in San Francisco, so I was trying to go close to every night, and I had the benefit. I was lucky, or I don't know, maybe I was funny, but I got booked pretty immediately when I started. So yeah, I mean, I tried as much as I could to go to a mic or at least do a show every night. It was a little trickier at that time because I still had, a full-time job, obviously. But
Hmm.
yeah, as much as and if I wasn't at a mic, I would go watch a show. I lived in the Mission in San Francisco, so there were a lot of shows within walking distance from my apartment. I just tried to at least be involved in some way, and I kind of still try that in LA, where it's like even if I don't have a show or go to a mic on a particular night, I either work on booking or work on writing or go hang out with comics, which is fun and they're my friends, but it's also kind of like a way to stay plugged in even when you're not performing.
Right. So at the beginning of your career, how did it go with repeating material? So you're doing stand up a lot. You're doing it every night. Did you constantly keep like every set was new material, or what's like the rule? What's the rule on recycling jokes? And when do you know that a joke it's time to let go and move on from?
Um, Interesting that you should ask that. So when I started, I didn't know anything about doing or starting stand up at all. And this is 2010, so it's not like there wasn't information out there, but it was kind of the start of this most recent boom, and now we're at a point where, like, if you want to start stand up, you can listen to a million different podcasts or shows, including this one, about how people started, what they did in any city you could choose. And there's blog posts and there's just a million different resources. I didn't have as many of those when I started, and I didn't really know at the time for like almost a year that it was normal to repeat material. So I was just kind of going to mics and either riffing or writing stuff that came to me that day. And then when I got booked on shows, I would repeat stuff, but I really didn't know, and no one really told me. So I, it was still an exercise in kind of getting rid of my stage fright. So I don't regret the method that I took, but it's interesting to watch. Well, especially because you have a late night focused show, but it's interesting to watch comics who just started in the past few years who have all of those resources and pay really close attention to these things coming out of the gate with like their 5 minutes or their 10 minutes and doing just that for years. And it's very weird to me. It's fine. It's just a different approach, It also works out for them a lot of the time because they do get those late night sets and they do get, these TV appearances. So what if the rest of us have to do festivals with them for years and listen to the same 5 minutes of jokes? I mean, there are like third-year comics that I can literally recite their top five, and even if it's really funny, that's just not what I got into comedy for. That's not the experience that I had. I was really trying to get some stuff off my chest, get less nervous, take risks, do things that were really scary. And I think as a result, like, I didn't get all that stuff that early, and I still haven't done the late night set. I would love to, but I do know, kind of going back to what I was saying before, that if I get an opportunity like that, that's a short set, and then out of that appearance come more opportunities to perform for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, I never worry that I don't have that time, And I think there's a lot of kids, I don't know, I feel weird calling them kids, like I'm not that old, but new comics who are in that position where they're like, oh shit, I got a late night set 2 years in because I have this perfect vibe, but now this club's asking me to headline and I don't have 50 minutes of material.
Right.
And that to me is much scarier than the alternative, which is like, potentially not getting those opportunities, because I always want to feel prepared for whatever opportunity I get. So, I got some things very early, but for the most part, I've been comfortable knowing that anything that came along, I was ready for, And I think that's flipped a lot with how much information people have about comedy, because now people get things earlier, and then when they have to deliver on the stand-up part, it's much harder. But, that's the part that gets me out of bed every morning. So it's like, I always feel good delivering on the stand-up part, whether the other things come along or not.
Now, how often are you writing new material, and what is your personal writing style? Are you a hand writer? Do you just type like a one word into your phone? How do you do it?
It's a mix, and it ebbs and flows, as you can imagine, especially as I'm kind of working on other things. And if I'm like writing on a pilot, then I'm spending less time writing stand-up, but and then sometimes you just have dry spells, and then you change your environment, you go out of town, whatever, something happens, and then all of a sudden you have a new 5 minutes. It's really inconsistent, but I try to write something every day, even if it's just a journal entry, just to kind of keep those juices flowing, because it is a muscle that you have to exercise. I mean, the same as like when I was singing, if I spent 3 months not looking at sheet music, then when I go back into it, it's going to feel a little awkward and like I'm just, my muscles a little weak at it. So I try to write something every day, but as far as new jokes, it's really all over the place. Like sometimes it goes on my phone, sometimes I write it down pen and paper. I always kind of have a journal and then a separate joke notebook for rough ideas. I'm trying to get better about the kind of follow through, because I'll forget tags or I'll listen to an old recording and then go like, oh, that's the laugh that used to be in this that section of this
Yeah.
joke. Like I kind of noticed a lull, but I couldn't remember what was missing. So I'm trying to, as much as I can, at least document like have a journal of sort of the complete version of jokes as much as anything can ever be complete, which is never for a comedian really, unless everybody's applauding and running down the aisles at every line. So I'm trying to get better about sort of documenting that. I also just totally forget about jokes. I'll have fans come out and say like, oh, will you do this one? And I'm like, I literally don't remember ever telling that. I don't know how it goes, and I have no record of it, which is bad, right? But, I do get tired of stuff and kind of churn it out fairly quickly, but it really kind of depends on my mood.
Have you ever incorporated your singing abilities in your stand-up abilities with like parody songs or, silly songs or any type of songwriting?
No, not really. I mean, I've performed like in musicals and stuff, and I mean, I guess kind of generally been involved in things that where like those things overlap. But as far as my own writing, I haven't written any songs. No, it seems like an obvious thing to do, but it's also not that kind of comic. So I think if I came out one day with a guitar and a song, like people would be very confused.
So, what type of comic would you say you are? If you were to describe yourself and your style, how would you describe it?
A woman comic. No.
Yeah.
I don't know. I never know how to answer that question. I guess it's just sort of like a life story. I mean, it's hopefully just an honest one, like I don't play a character. I try as much as I can to have my comedy be close to how it would be if you just had a conversation with me. I guess those are always the comics that I liked the most. So I don't really know how to describe the style. Hopefully it's unique. I mean, that's the sort of the goal, is to not be able to compare yourself to anyone. There's always things that we borrow unknowingly or knowingly for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Some people just straight up steal. But there's always little style things we pick up that come and go, and you'll see kind of certain words and movements like in the zeitgeist, and it's good to kind of notice those things. And that's another reason I would encourage any especially new comic to go out and see and do as much as you can, because a lot of the time you'll go out in your town and go like, oh, there's 10 other comics that have a joke about this thing or are saying this word or are doing this segue or whatever it is. Like there are styles in LA and New York that you notice, and I try to note those things because as much as I can, I want to not be influenced by them and just sound like myself.
Yeah, totally. Now, you said you've been doing it for stand-up for, you said 8 years, right? So what was a moment for you at any point in your career where you really were like, I can do this. I am a stand-up comedian, and you knew you had made it, in air quotes, made it?
I mean, I still don't feel that way. I've never had that feeling. I don't know if that happens for most people, because there's always kind of the next thing that you want to do, and I'm not, maybe you're catching me on a bad day, but when I woke up this morning, one of the first things that I did was like look for day jobs and also look into grad schools. Like 3 days out of every week, maybe 3 or 4, I am thinking about my plan B. I'm putting all of my work into stand up and making this a full-time thing, but it still isn't. And I think that is true for many years, that you're a comic and other people perceive you that way. But, you still have to walk dogs and wait tables and watch kids, whatever it is. And it's scary, it's scary to have that instability. And I guess I would get to that point if I were doing it full time and, felt comfortable paying my rent every month. Then maybe I would feel that way. But having said that, I know plenty of people who are in that position who still don't feel like it's 100%. There's like, I've talked to people like, I think Martha Kelly is a really great example of this, that she did comedy for so long and was kind of under the radar and worked day jobs, and then she got cast on Basket. And then she didn't have to work for a while. But she by no means thinks that this is like setting her up for the rest of her life. She's already thinking about contingency plans, and I don't think it's a bad thing to do to be realistic, but as much as you can kind of stay working 100% on your goals and whatever your dreams are, while still keeping kind of one foot in the practicality water, I think is a good idea. So, so I don't know. I haven't made it. I'm not even close to making it. So, but I don't know when that feeling will happen.
Well, then let me ask you this. What has been, out of the 8 years, your most proud moment doing stand-up?
It's hard to say. I guess, I think certainly the first time I ever headlined a club, I felt really proud. I think the first time, recording my album was huge, because that's such a huge commitment to the material and the work that I put in up until that day. It was a mix of kind of new jokes and jokes that were 4 or 5 years old that I had kind of when I started. And I think the commitment and the marriage to those jokes, to say, I'm going to put you down on a CD and a record, and I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to be proud of it, was a really big moment, especially as wishy-washy as I am with my material in general, and just how quickly I abandon things, my jokes, I mean, not not other things. That was definitely a big moment. And I think the first time I really did an hour that I liked all of it and had fun was huge, because when you start, you're doing 3 minutes at open mics, and it feels like the hardest and scariest thing in the world. And I always felt like I was going to throw up or shit my pants. And so realizing, a few years in, like, oh, I just did an hour of comedy, personal comedy. It was fun. I liked all of it, and people enjoyed it, and people paid for it, is a really huge moment, and I'm still trying to be as grateful as I can for all those milestones,
Yeah, definitely. Now, I do want to talk about your podcast, Who's Your God? So can you tell me a little bit about the podcast and how it came about?
Sure. I co-host it with 2 other comedians, Steve Hernandez and John Michael Bond, who both grew up Christian. Steve used to be a pastor, a megachurch pastor, and John's dad currently is still a pastor. He listens to our show every week, and he's been on it. And I grew up in the church as well, and I just kind of realized that outside of if people tell jokes about it, for the most part, comedians don't really sit around and talk about their sort of deep spiritual and religious beliefs, their reasons for existing, their reasons for staying alive, and coping mechanisms very often. It's not something we kind of shoot the shit about when we're out at a bar or after a show. And it's not something you hear a ton about on podcasts, even ones that go pretty deep. It's like if you listen to WTF, for example, like religion sometimes comes up, but for the most part, it's like, family stuff and career stuff and romance stuff. And I think it's a really big topic that is fun to tackle in a funny way. And it's a super funny show, because even when things get heavy, and we've had several people cry and talk about real trauma from the church. It's still hilarious, and I love that combination. And we had Wanda Sykes on. We've had all these amazing people that I've never seen in interviews open up about that stuff specifically. So it's been interesting for me as someone who's kind of in a place in my life where I don't know that I'm necessarily like a super atheist anymore. My pendulum is sort of swinging the other way. I was really mad at the church for a long time, and now I understand it. I understand why people need Jesus, why they benefit from it, why people go to church. I don't think Christians are idiots. I don't think all Christians are racist Republicans, although there are a lot of them. I'm a little bit more open now to people kind of making it work however they can, because it's really hard to be alive a lot of the time. And, if you benefit from church and the Lord, or whatever religion you practice without hurting anyone, I'm at the point now where, like, that is fine with me. Also, it doesn't matter what I think people are going to do it anyway. But previously, when I was in, the phase of still being really bitter about my church experience, I think I kind of judged people for that, for still being religious. And now I'm kind of turned around on that. So it's been interesting to see where comedians lie on that spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Do you see, and I mean, you might not, you probably don't, but do you see a lot of comedians who are openly religious? And what I mean by that is, like, before their sets, you can see them praying and they take it very seriously. Do you see a lot of that?
Not a lot before their sets necessarily, although I think that people pray privately. I know plenty of comedians, some of whom we've had on the show, who are openly Christian, openly Muslim, devout Jews. Like, I think it happens a lot. I think it just doesn't always come up because other comedians can be really judgmental about that kind of stuff. And there's a real stigma attached to being religious in, whatever the bubble we exist in. And I think a lot of people are just jerks about it. So it keeps people from kind of speaking up. And that's been interesting on the podcast, because I'll talk to comedians that I had no idea were religious that tell me, they pray multiple times a day, particularly if they're Muslim, a handful of times a day, as like, comedians living in LA who are like potheads and drink and whatever still have this commitment to praying 5 times a day. And it's been really interesting to find that out, because I think, people just don't bring it up because comedians are assholes.
Yeah. And I wonder too if they don't bring it up because it would be like, okay, you've explicitly told me that you're a practicing Muslim, you're praying 5 times a day. I expect you to talk about this in your stand-up. You know what I mean? There's the stigma of, oh, this is your life, and so you're talking about your life, so tell me everything, make jokes about it. And I just don't know. For some people, I feel like that would work, and for others, they might not want to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think that's definitely part of it. And I think also on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who might come to the show, or comedians who are, 100% devout Christians who do like the Christian circuit, that would also judge those comics who are kind of in the middle, like, for example, the comic I mentioned who is Muslim and prays 5 times a day, but smokes pot. I'm sure he has to contend with devout Muslims to say, like, you're not really devout, you're not really committed to this religion because you do comedy and you say dirty words on stage and you do drugs and whatever. And it's like, I think there are people on both sides of that will be jerks about it. So it's kind of, so we've tried to sort of create this judgment-free zone where people can be anywhere on the spectrum of their beliefs, that they, that's what we call it, the podcast for whatever you believe in. Like, but yeah, I think you're definitely right that that's part of it.
Well, I think it's a very cool idea, and I think you're tackling it, like you said, it's a subject, it's an area that's not brought up in late night interviews, or just as you were talking about it, I was like, she's right. Like you never hear these topics talked about in such a serious manner and also in such a light-hearted way. So I think what you're doing is very unique and it's very cool. And I mean, that's why you've been so successful with it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it's something that's always been kind of one of those things that's off the table, right? When you go to Thanksgiving, you don't talk about politics, religion, or money. And I think, the politics thing has gone completely out the window in the last few years, that it's, you really see people doubling down and fighting for what they believe in. And even if it means, ruining Thanksgiving or not talking to certain family members. So now it's like, well, what else is back on the table? I think money has changed in that way too, that, the classes are so starkly divided that, a lot more of us are kind of being transparent about financial stuff. And I think, if religion gets to that point, it's great. And I think this sort of next generation, people who are teenagers now, who are kind of socially more liberal than any generation before them, who are like, yeah, I like going to church with my family and I believe in God, but I also like gay people, like I have gay friends, and they will, I think, redefine kind of how we think about a lot of this stuff and not be so weird about talking about it the same way that they're not, as weird about talking about sex or sexuality or the spectrum of sexuality.
Right.
And I think it's only going to get better and like easier for people to believe in things without having to follow this sort of strict set of rules, which has never worked well.
Right, and without fear of being judged for it or being put down for it. They'll feel more open to the acceptance of others.
Definitely, yeah.
So, Amy, I do want to know, as we start to wrap up the interview, I do want to know, who is your favorite comedian? And then personally for you, what is your favorite joke?
My own favorite joke or someone else's?
It's just whatever the first joke that came to your mind is your favorite joke. So whatever that means to you.
Oh, okay, I missed a little bit of that because I think we got disconnected. But I don't know about my favorite joke. That's a really tough one to answer. Favorite comedian? That's also kind of tough. There's so many people that have kind of influenced me that I think are genius beyond belief. I think Maria Bamford is definitely one of those people. I think Joey Diaz is one of the most charismatic and hilarious comedians I've ever seen. Like, as far as people who I watch and make me really double over, and not only double over, but make me feel like we don't even do the same job. They're so amazing at it, like there's so many light years ahead of me. Certainly Maria, Joey, JB Smoove, Cat Williams, I think is one of the funniest people ever. I guess those are sort of my big ones. Norm Macdonald has been kind of a big deal to me for a long time. I think he's one of the funniest people ever, one of the greatest joke writers.
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah, he's the best, and he's a very sweet man. Yeah, favorite joke? I don't know. I don't think I can really answer that one.
Okay. All right. What do you have a joke for yourself that you remember writing that might be the top joke you've ever written? In your opinion?
I think the kind of one that people bring up to me the most and feels like, I guess, the most authentic version of whatever my style is, which I guess is going back to your earlier question. If I had to sort of sum up what I want to do with comedy in one sentence, it's really to kind of talk about hard things or be self-deprecating in an empowered way. This is I didn't invent this by any means, but I think the pattern that a lot of my jokes have is, here's a sad thing, or here's something I'm going to say where you think I'm putting myself down. And then the twist is that I came out as the empowered person in that story or won in some way. That's really, I think, what I'm always trying to pull off. is this thing where people go, oh, like, she's insulting herself or she's telling a sad thing about her childhood, and then at the end it's like, oh no, she's an asshole and
Yeah.
she's not a victim in any way. So I think something that kind of sums that up the best is a joke I have, which I'm not going to tell because you can find it on the internet. But
Totally.
I told it on Last Comic, and it's really a joke about my dad sort of saying something really funny to, or really mean to me in a funny way, and then me joking about how he died really young. And that's also something that when I, and then there's a much more graphic kind of visual about his corpse, and it's very dark. It's very dark, and I try to make it kind of sound cute, and that's something that when I did it on Last Comic, like, Norm really liked, the twist in that. And I think that's sort of like the joke people bring up to me the most and maybe gets the most interesting reaction. So, yeah, I mean, it's probably up on my website if you guys want to see how it goes. It's definitely on my album, which everyone should buy.
Yeah, for sure. And my final question for you is one I ask every single guest. So the question is, if you were to give one piece of advice to someone who eventually wants to be in your shoes, what piece of advice would you give?
Just perform as much as you can, write as much as you can, try to be nice, be patient, and be proactive. Don't be afraid to ask for things, but have some self-awareness about also when you're asking too much and, the way in which you're asking. But in general, there's space for everyone, allegedly. And if you're funny and nice, things will happen.
I like it. And Amy, if people want to, like you mentioned, buy your album or maybe see you perform soon, in what ways can they find you online or see you in person?
Online, amymillercomedy.com is my website. On Twitter, it's just Amy Miller, Amy Miller Comedy on Instagram, and I have show dates on all three of those things.
All right, that's perfect. And Amy, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm glad we got to do it and got to make it happen, and it was great talking to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for doing it, man.
And to anybody else listening, remember, you can visit us at our website at www.talkinglatenight.com. You can also find us at our Facebook page at Talking Late Night, and you can find us on iTunes where you can rate and leave us a review. So thanks again to Amy for being on the show. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll see you next time.